My brother sent me a list of 5 humiliating demands I had to obey just to be allowed at his wedding. Complete them, and maybe you will be worthy of standing beside us, he told me. I laughed, booked a one-way flight to Bali, and sent him one final gift. When he opened it in front of every single elite guest, his face went completely white. If you have ever been treated like a second-class citizen by your own blood stick around, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit subscribe to hear how I gave my golden child brother the exact wedding present he deserved. My name is Camille. I am 33 years old and the founder and CEO of a private cybersecurity firm in Chicago. For years, I have kept my massive success entirely hidden from my parents, Thomas and Cynthia, and my 35-year-old brother, Brad. They always viewed me as the family disappointment, the quiet girl wasting her life on an IT hobby, while Brad played the role of a hotshot corporate investor. In reality, Brad is a mid-level manager drowning in debt, but my parents treat his illusions like absolute gospel. I was enjoying my morning espresso looking out over the city from my penthouse when my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was sent to our family group chat with the subject line, "Conditions for Camille's attendance." I set my espresso cup down on the marble counter and opened the message. The sheer audacity of Brad's words practically leapt off the screen. "Camille," he began. "Since Jasmine and I are hosting Chicago Elite at the Monterey Estate, next month we need to make sure the aesthetics and social dynamics are flawless. If you want to attend my wedding, you must agree to the following 5 conditions." I scrolled down, feeling my pulse quicken not with tears, but with a cold, sharp anger. Condition 1 read, "You will wear a plain beige non-designer dress and sit at the back table near the kitchen exits. We cannot have your usual thrift store style clashing with the bridal party." Condition 2. Do not under any circumstances mention your little IT hobby to Jasmine's family. Her father, Desmond Washington, is a logistics tycoon, and we need to project real wealth. Keep your mouth shut about your struggling business. Condition 3. Wire $10,000 to my account by Friday to cover the floral arrangements. Consider it your long overdue contribution to this family since you never help out with anything else. Condition 4. You will serve as the designated babysitter for the guests' toddlers during the evening reception. We hired professionals for the main events, but need coverage for the late-night party, and you are not going to be mingling anyway. And then came the final demand, the one that actually made me laugh out loud in my empty kitchen. Condition 5. Sign over your 20% share of Grandpa's trust fund by tomorrow morning. I need the liquidity to prove my assets to Desmond for the down payment on our new house. You do not need the money anyway, and this will finally prove you care about my future. Before I could even process the absolute delusion required to type those words, a text message popped up from my mother, Cynthia. She had been copied on the email, of course. "Just do it, Camille," her text read. "Do not be stubborn and ruin this for him like you ruined his 30th birthday by refusing to pay off his credit card bill. Jasmine comes from Black royalty in this city, and Brad needs this marriage to secure his future. Be a good sister for once in your life and sign the papers. Do not make us beg." I stared at the screen, the familiar toxic weight of my family dynamic pressing down on me. I thought back to his 30th birthday when they ambushed me at a restaurant demanding I drain my meager savings to cover his gambling debts. I refused, and my father Thomas told me I was dead to him for 6 months. They always expected me to be the sacrificial lamb to fuel Brad's delusions of grandeur. They thought I was still that struggling girl scraping by repairing laptops in a basement. They had no idea I was running a company that secured data for federal contractors, or that my personal net worth eclipsed their wildest dreams combined. I did not type out a furious paragraph. I did not call them crying to defend my career or my worth. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air of my penthouse, and let all the lingering familial guilt evaporate. I opened the group chat and typed exactly 4 words. Received. Good luck, Brad. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the counter. Tonight was the official meet, the family's engagement dinner at an ultra-exclusive steakhouse downtown. Brad had spent weeks boasting about how he was going to impress Desmond Washington and officially merge their worlds. He expected me to show up cowed, submissive, and ready to hand over my inheritance to fund his fake lifestyle. I walked into my walk-in closet and bypassed the plain beige dresses entirely. Instead, I pulled out a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect in any boardroom. I grabbed my purse, making sure a very specific, solid, titanium American Express Centurion card was tucked securely inside one of the zippered pockets. I was going to that expensive engagement dinner tonight, but I was absolutely not playing by his ridiculous rules anymore. It was finally time to meet my future sister-in-law, Jasmine, and see exactly what kind of fragile house of cards my brother had built for himself. The heavy oak doors of the steakhouse opened, letting in the sharp Chicago evening air. I stepped inside the opulent lobby, the ambient noise of clinking crystal and low conversations washing over me. I smoothed the lapels of my custom charcoal suit. It was a power piece, tailored to perfection, exuding the kind of silent wealth that did not need to scream for attention. I gave my name to the hostess, but before she could guide me to the private dining room, a hand clamped down hard on my bicep. I was yanked roughly into a dimly lit corridor near the coat check. My father, Thomas, stood blocking my path. His face flushed red with manic energy. Beside him, my mother Cynthia nervously wrung her hands. The heavy scent of her Chanel perfume mixed with the sharp odor of their shared panic. There were no greetings, no hugs, not even a basic acknowledgement of my presence. "Listen to me very carefully," Thomas hissed, his grip tightening on my arm, before I calmly but forcefully shoved his hand away. "You are going to walk into that room, and you are going to keep your mouth completely shut. You will nod, you will smile, and you will not say a single word about your life." I adjusted my sleeve, staring at him with detached amusement. A simple hello would have sufficed. "What exactly is the crisis tonight?" Cynthia stepped forward, her eyes wide and frantic. She grabbed my shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my jacket. "Brad is playing in the major leagues now, Camille. Jasmine is an incredible woman, and her family is black royalty in this city. Her father is Desmond Washington. Do you understand what that means?" I knew exactly who Desmond Washington was. He owned one of the largest private logistics and shipping empires in the Midwest. He was a titan, a self-made billionaire known for his ruthless business acumen and his absolute devotion to his family. Jasmine, his only daughter, was an Ivy League graduate and a powerhouse in her own right. "I know who they are," I replied, keeping my voice deadpan. "What I do not know is why you are both sweating in a coat check closet." Thomas leaned in close, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Brad told them he is a tech investor. He told them he is a millionaire. He told Desmond that his portfolio is massive and that he is backing multiple successful startups." The sheer audacity of the lie hit me like a physical blow. Brad was a mid-level manager at a failing paper supply company. He was drowning in consumer debt, constantly leasing cars he could not afford and begging our parents to cover his rent. He was not a millionaire. He was a financial sinkhole. And he had somehow conned a billionaire and his brilliant daughter into believing he was their equal. Suddenly, the ridiculous list of demands made perfect sense. Brad was not just being a tyrant. He was terrified. He needed me in a cheap beige dress, sitting at the back of the room, because if I showed up looking successful, it would invite questions. Questions he could not answer. Questions that would unravel his entire fraudulent existence. He needed to present me as his charity case to explain away why his own sister was not part of his wealthy elite circle. "If you embarrass your brother with your cheap, struggling lifestyle," Cynthia spat, her voice dripping with pure venom, "you are dead to us. You will not mention your little computer repair hobby. You will let Brad lead the conversation. This marriage is his chance to secure his future. If you ruin this for him, I swear to God, Camille, you will never step foot in our house again." I looked at the two people who raised me. They were actively participating in a massive financial and emotional con against a highly respected family, all to protect their golden child. There was no guilt in their eyes, only a feral determination to protect Brad's illusions. You want me to be the pathetic, struggling sister, I stated, the coldness in my voice making Thomas flinch slightly. You want me to act as a prop for his delusion. We want you to be a good sister for once, Thomas growled. Now get in there and do not ruin this. I did not argue. I did not yell about my actual success or my bank accounts. I simply smiled a sharp, razor-thin smile and walked past them toward the private dining room. The maitre d' pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, revealing a breathtaking private space overlooking the Chicago River. At the head of the table sat Desmond Washington. He possessed an undeniable aura of power, dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, observing the room with the quiet intensity of a predator assessing its territory. Beside him sat Jasmine, stunning and elegant, radiating intelligence and grace. And there, sitting opposite them, was my brother Brad. He was laughing too loudly, his face shiny with a light sheen of nervous sweat. He was playing the part of the carefree millionaire, but his eyes darted around the room with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. When Brad saw me enter, his laugh died in his throat. He practically leaped out of his chair, rushing over to intercept me before I could get too close to the Washingtons. Camille, Brad said loudly, forcing a wide, fake smile. You made it. Jasmine. Mr. Washington, this is my little sister Camille. She is the one I told you about. The condescension in his tone was heavy, a clear signal to the Washingtons that I was the family burden he so generously tolerated. He tried to steer me toward an empty chair at the absolute far end of the table, as far away from Desmond as physically possible. But I did not move toward the empty chair. Instead, I stepped smoothly around Brad and walked directly up to Desmond Washington. I extended my hand, my posture perfectly straight, my expression composed and unbothered. It is an absolute pleasure to meet you, Mr. Washington, I said, my voice steady and resonant. And Jasmine, congratulations on the engagement. You look beautiful. Jasmine smiled genuinely, returning my greeting. Desmond stood up slowly. As he took my hand, his grip was firm and testing. I matched his pressure effortlessly. Desmond did not just shake my hand, he studied me. He was a man who had built an empire by reading people, by spotting inconsistencies in a fraction of a second. His sharp eyes took in my bespoke charcoal suit, the precise cut of the fabric, the subtle flash of the expensive timepiece on my wrist, and the absolute lack of intimidation in my posture. He looked at my face, finding only calm, calculated confidence. Then he briefly shifted his gaze to Brad, who was visibly vibrating with panic, wiping his forehead with a napkin. Desmond released my hand, his expression entirely unreadable, but a dangerous, calculating light sparked in his dark eyes. He had been told I was a struggling, pathetic charity case. But Desmond Washington knew power when he saw it, and he knew instantly that the woman standing before him was not a victim. He sensed the massive, glaring disconnect between Brad's story and reality, and the silent question hung heavily in the air as he gestured for me to sit down. As I took my seat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, I could feel Desmond Washington evaluating my every movement. He was a man who built a global logistics empire from nothing, and men like him do not survive by ignoring their instincts. He watched me fold my linen napkin and place it on my lap. He noted the precise, unhurried way I engaged with the waitstaff. Brad had painted me as a desperate, socially inept charity case, but Desmond was already reading the silent signals that contradicted every single word my brother had spoken. Brad, entirely oblivious to the tycoon studying me, continued to hold court at the center of the room. He spoke loudly over the ambient jazz music and the clinking of crystal wine glasses, determined to dominate the narrative. He was sweating slightly, a thin sheen of desperation coating his forehead, as he tried to match the effortless elegance of the Washington family. He practically shouted to the sommelier to keep pouring the expensive vintage Cabernet, eager to prove his worth through excessive, flashy consumption. Cynthia and Thomas beamed with pride, nodding along as if every corporate buzzword Brad misused was a stroke of absolute genius. Jasmine sat perfectly poised beside him, her posture immaculate, but her eyes held a sharp, analytical edge. She was listening closely, processing the data, and I could tell she was not entirely buying the performance. Brad leaned back in his leather chair and swirled his wine, directing his attention entirely to Desmond. I was actually just reviewing the final municipal permits for the wedding venue today, Brad said, his voice carrying an unmistakable tone of arrogance. The Monterey estate is completely locked down for the weekend. I acquired the coastal property last year as a portfolio piece, but I decided to take it off the market specifically for Jasmine. It is a stunning private compound, only the best for my bride. He reached over and patted Jasmine's hand with a performative display of affection. Jasmine offered a polite smile, but Desmond paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. A coastal property of that magnitude is a significant holding, Desmond noted, his voice low and gravelly. Real estate in that sector has been highly volatile recently. It requires serious capital and exceptional management to maintain. Brad waved his free hand dismissively, masking his panic with false bravado. Capital is never an issue when you know how to leverage the right emerging markets, Desmond. It is just about knowing exactly where to put your money, and frankly, someone in the family has to be the successful provider. Then Brad turned his gaze toward me. I saw the malicious familiar glint in his eye. He could not just elevate himself in front of these elite guests, he had to step firmly on my neck to do it. Take Camille, for example, Brad announced to the entire table, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. She is still struggling to get her little computer repair business off the ground. It is cute, really. She fixes broken laptops, sets up home Wi-Fi networks, things like that. I actually have to subsidize her rent every month just to make sure she does not end up moving back into our parents' basement. Cynthia let out a high, nervous laugh, chiming in immediately to back up her golden child. We are just so grateful Brad is financially secure enough to care for his sister. She has always lacked his ambition, but family takes care of family. I stared at my mother, feeling a familiar icy calmness wash over me. I remembered being 22 years old, working 3 exhausting jobs to fund my first commercial server rack, while they drained their savings to co-sign a luxury car lease for Brad after he wrecked his previous one. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I simply looked at Brad and let him dig his grave deeper. Jasmine frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the overt, unnecessary cruelty, while Desmond narrowed his eyes heavily, studying my complete lack of reaction to the public insult. The waiter approached the table, carrying a sleek black leather folder. He placed it discreetly near Brad, as Brad had loudly insisted on hosting the dinner when we first arrived. The total for the private dining room, the imported Wagyu steaks, the truffles, and the multiple bottles of reserve wine was exceptionally steep. I knew the pricing at the steakhouse well. The bill was easily $8,000. Brad picked up the leather folder and opened it. For a fraction of a second, the color completely drained from his face. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He quickly snapped the folder shut and began a highly theatrical patting of his suit jacket pockets. "Oh, wow!" Brad chuckled, a nervous, high-pitched sound that grated against the quiet elegance of the room. "This is unbelievable. I must have left my premium card in my other jacket. I switched suits at the last minute because of a stain. Thomas, do you mind covering this? I will wire you the funds first thing tomorrow morning, I promise." Thomas froze. His eyes darted from the leather folder to Cynthia, his face turning an embarrassing shade of crimson. My parents were comfortably middle class, but they absolutely did not have $8,000 in disposable cash sitting in a checking account to cover a single dinner. Thomas cleared his throat, his hands visibly shaking under the table. "Well, Brad, I might need to step outside and call the bank to authorize a daily charge this large on my standard card." The silence at the table became suffocating. Desmond set his napkin down, his sharp gaze cutting right through Brad's pathetic charade. Jasmine looked away, her jaw tight with obvious humiliation. Brad was sweating heavily now, actual beads of moisture forming on his forehead. He looked at me, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes, begging me to play the role of the submissive sister and somehow fix the disaster he had created. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my designer handbag. I bypassed my standard business credit cards and pulled out a solid titanium American Express Centurion card. The legendary black card. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and completely unmistakable to anyone who moved in elite financial circles. I casually tossed the heavy metal card onto the leather tray. It landed with a loud, distinctive thud that echoed sharply in the quiet room. Put the entire balance on this, I told the waiter, my voice perfectly calm and authoritative. And please add a 30% gratuity for the excellent service tonight. The waiter, highly trained to recognize premium elite clients, immediately bowed his head. Right away, madam. Thank you very much. Cynthia gasped loudly, her hand flying up to clutch her pearls. Thomas stared at the black card as if it were an alien artifact that had just dropped from the sky. Brad looked as though the floor had just opened up beneath him, his face a mask of absolute terror and confusion. But it was Desmond Washington whose reaction mattered most. The billionaire tycoon did not miss a single detail. He recognized the titanium card instantly. He knew that the Amex Centurion was invitation only, requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual spending and an astronomical net worth just to qualify. Desmond slowly turned his head away from the sweating, panicked Brad and locked his piercing gaze directly onto me. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table, a predatory, brilliant intellect flashing in his dark eyes. Exactly what kind of computer repair do you do, Camille? Desmond Washington kept his dark, piercing eyes locked onto mine, waiting for an answer. I did not break his gaze. I rested my hands neatly on my lap, completely unfazed by the heavy silence that had settled over the private dining room. I am the founder and CEO of a private cybersecurity firm. I replied, my voice perfectly steady and clear. We specialize in zero-trust architecture and secure data systems, primarily for federal contractors and enterprise-level financial institutions. The shift in the room was instantaneous. Jasmine set her crystal wine glass down on the table, her posture changing from polite observation to genuine professional respect. The obligatory smile of a future sister-in-law vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a woman who recognized a fellow power player. She leaned forward and asked me a highly technical question about a recent federal mandate regarding data compliance. Her question proved immediately that she was just as brilliant as her father, and that she did not miss a single detail. I answered her with the exact technical specifications required, showing her I was not just a figurehead, but the actual architect of my company. Desmond let out a low, appreciative hum, leaning back in his leather chair. That is a far cry from fixing broken laptops in a basement. He noted a subtle edge of dark amusement in his voice. That was when Brad absolutely lost his mind. He practically lunged across the table, pushing his chair back so violently it scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He physically stepped into my line of sight, desperately trying to block me from Desmond's view. Oh, she loves to use the big corporate buzzwords, Brad laughed, but the sound was high-pitched, frantic, and entirely devoid of humor. It is really just a little boutique startup, Desmond. She exaggerates the government stuff. It is mostly just basic consulting for local offices. Nothing on your level. Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, I felt a sharp, vicious kick to my left shin. I did not flinch, but I glanced to my side. My mother, Cynthia, was glaring at me, her eyes wide with frantic rage, her jaw set in a hard line. Thomas cleared his throat loudly, practically shouting a question to Desmond about the Chicago Bears' upcoming season, desperately trying to steer the conversation away from my unexpected display of power and wealth. I sat back and took a sip of my sparkling water, perfectly content to let them scramble. The more Brad talked over me, the more he tried to diminish my actual multi-million-dollar company, the smaller and more pathetic he looked. Desmond and Jasmine were not foolish people. They saw the sheer panic radiating from my brother. They saw a man trying to silence his own sister to protect a fragile ego. The dinner eventually dragged to a painful close, the atmosphere suffocatingly tense, despite the premium wine and Wagyu beef. We moved outside to the valet stand, waiting in the biting chill of the Chicago night air. Desmond and Jasmine were wrapped in conversation with the valet manager a few yards away, while my parents hovered nervously near the restaurant entrance, keeping a watchful eye on the Washingtons. Brad saw his opening. He grabbed my elbow, pulling me hard into the shadows behind a large stone pillar away from the streetlights. His grip was entirely too tight, his fingers digging into the fabric of my tailored suit. "You just could not let me have one single night," he snarled, his face mere inches from mine, his breath smelling sourly of red wine and fear. "You had to sit there and try to show off. You had to pull out that flashy plastic and make me look like a fool in front of my future father-in-law." I looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve until he slowly let go, stepping back slightly. "You made yourself look like a fool, Brad," I said, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any sisterly warmth. "You lied about your wealth. You lied about my life. I simply paid the bill you could not afford to cover." But as I looked at my brother standing there in the dim light, my professional training kicked in. I read human behavior for a living, looking for vulnerabilities, threats, and signs of deception. Brad was not just angry about being upstaged. He was completely terrified. Despite the freezing Chicago wind, sweat was pouring down the sides of his face, soaking the collar of his expensive rented dress shirt. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them deep into his trouser pockets to hide the tremors. This was not the reaction of a man whose pride had been bruised. This was the physiological response of a man backed into a corner, staring down total absolute ruin. My mind raced, connecting the dots I had previously ignored. The aggressive demand for my 20% share of our grandfather's trust fund. The bizarre insistence on $10,000 for floral arrangements. The absolute panic over an $8,000 dinner bill. The math was not adding up. He was hiding a massive, dangerous financial lie, and he was trying to use my assets and my silence to cover his tracks. The valet pulled my sleek luxury sedan around to the curb. I stepped away from Brad, buttoning my coat against the wind. I did not say another word to him or my parents. I got into my car, locked the doors, and merged into the city traffic. As I drove away from the steakhouse, I mentally mapped out my morning. I was not going to wait for him to demand my trust fund again. I was going to run a full, deep web background check on my own brother and find out exactly what kind of monster I was dealing with. The glowing monitors in my penthouse office illuminated the stark, undeniable truth about my brother. The deep web background check had finished compiling just before dawn, and the results were worse than a simple lie. Brad was not just broke, he was a walking financial crater. The data revealed a labyrinth of defaulted loans, maxed out credit lines, and shadow accounts clinging to the edge of bankruptcy. He was in dangerously deep, and Jasmine's billionaire father was clearly his only perceived exit strategy. Before I could fully digest the sheer scale of his financial ruin, my phone buzzed on the glass desk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I answered, and her voice came through tight and commanding. "You need to come to the house immediately. Your father and I are waiting." It was not a request. It was a summons. I knew exactly what this was about. My performance with the Centurion card the night before had completely obliterated their narrative of the struggling, pathetic daughter. Instead of commanding respect, my revealed wealth had only painted a giant target on my back. I closed my laptop, grabbed my car keys, and drove to the suburban house where I had spent my childhood entirely in Brad's shadow. The moment I stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of lemon polish and stale resentment hit me. I was directed into the formal living room, a space entirely dedicated to Brad's past achievements. His old sports trophies and framed business degrees dominated the shelves, while my existence was barely a footnote. Thomas stood rigidly by the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest. Cynthia sat stiffly on the edge of the velvet sofa. On the glass coffee table between them sat a thick manila folder and an expensive silver pen. "Sit down," Camille Thomas ordered, not bothering with a greeting. I remained standing, my hands resting easily in the pockets of my trench coat. "I prefer to stand." "What is the emergency?" Thomas let out a harsh, frustrated breath and gestured sharply to the folder on the table. "We had the family lawyer draft these up first thing this morning. These are the transfer documents for your 20% share of your grandpa's trust fund. After your little stunt with that credit card last night, it is completely obvious you have more than enough money." Cynthia leaned forward, her eyes wide with a frantic, greedy energy. Brad needs the liquidity for the house down payment immediately. He has to prove his assets to Desmond by the end of the week to secure the Monterey estate. You have your business, Camille. Your brother needs this to secure Jasmine. This marriage is the most important thing to ever happen to this family. The sheer entitlement hanging in the room was suffocating. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding I hand over a massive sum of my own inheritance to fund a fraudulent lifestyle for a man who had treated me like dirt his entire life. Demand number 5 from Brad's email was no longer just a ridiculous request, it was their official strategy. Thomas picked up the silver pen and held it out toward me. Sign it right now. We are not playing games today. You owe him for being such a difficult child and causing so much tension over the years. This is how you make it right. I stared at the pen in his outstretched hand. The absolute delusion required to speak those words was staggering. I looked at my father, then at my mother, and felt the last remaining thread of familial obligation snap completely. I owe him, I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made Thomas lower his hand slightly. I owe the man who has lied about every single aspect of his life. I took a slow step forward, looking directly into my mother's eyes. Like when you took my college tuition savings to bail him out of his sports gambling debts at 22. Cynthia flinched, her face paling rapidly, as I dragged the buried family secret out into the harsh morning light. You drained my bank account to cover his bets, I continued, the cold truth slicing through their manufactured reality. You told me that family helps family, but it only ever meant me sacrificing my future for his mistakes. You forced me to work 3 jobs to pay for my own education while you protected your golden child. And now you want me to sign over my inheritance to fund a fake coastal estate so he can con a billionaire. That is different. Thomas shouted, his face turning a mottled red as he stepped away from the fireplace. He is building a legacy. You are just being selfish and vindictive. Sign the papers, Camille. I looked at the legal documents resting on the glass table. I am not signing anything. The room went dead silent for a fraction of a second before Cynthia absolutely exploded. She sprang up from the sofa, her voice shrill and trembling with pure, unadulterated fury. If you do not sign those papers right now, you are no longer part of this family, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You will be completely disowned. We will cut you off entirely, and do not even think about showing up at the Monterey estate next month. You are officially banned from the wedding. You are dead to us. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the threat. They genuinely believed that cutting me off would break me. They thought losing their toxic, conditional love was the ultimate punishment. A sharp, genuine laugh escaped my lips. The sound echoed loudly in the stuffy living room, completely startling both of them. It was the laugh of a woman who had just been handed the exact freedom she had always craved. You cannot fire me from a job I quit years ago, I said, buttoning my coat with deliberate, unhurried movements. Good luck explaining to Desmond Washington why the sister he met last night is suddenly banned from the wedding. I am sure he will not find that suspicious at all. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, leaving them standing in stunned, panicked silence. I got into my car and immediately punched the address for my corporate headquarters into the GPS. My cybersecurity team was waiting. Brad had declared war to protect his fragile house of cards, and it was time to show him exactly what happens when you try to con a woman who controls the data. The drive from the stifling atmosphere of my parents' suburban enclave to the sleek glass and steel tower housing my company headquarters took exactly 32 minutes. I badged into the private executive elevator, the quiet hum of the machinery matching the cold, calculated rhythm of my thoughts. By the time the doors slid open onto the top floor, my anger had completely crystallized into sharp, actionable focus. My firm operated like a fortress. Rows of analysts sat behind dual monitor setups, actively monitoring threat vectors for defense contractors and international banks. I bypassed my corner office entirely and walked straight to the secure operations pit at the center of the floor. Marcus, my lead forensic data analyst, looked up as I approached. He had been with me since the startup days, a brilliant digital tracker who could trace a single stolen dollar through a dozen international shell companies before his morning coffee. He took one look at my face, and immediately locked his workstation screen. I need a full forensic financial teardown, I told him, keeping my voice low enough to avoid echoing across the pit. Total discretion, no footprints. Treat it like a hostile domestic threat assessment. Give me a target. Marcus said, his hands already hovering over his keyboard. Bradford Thomas. My brother. Marcus did not ask questions. He pulled up a sterile terminal interface and initiated the protocol. I stood behind him, my arms crossed, watching the data streams begin to populate. We started with the surface-level public records credit bureaus, registered banking institutions. Within 10 minutes, the initial portrait of Brad's finances materialized on the screen, and it was pathetic. His legitimate checking account at a mid-tier regional bank held less than $400. His savings account had been closed due to inactivity over a year ago. His salary from the paper supply company was entirely consumed by basic living expenses and high-interest credit card minimums within 48 hours of his direct deposits clearing. He is broke, Marcus stated, highlighting a column of red numbers. Factoring in his outstanding consumer debt, his actual net worth is significantly negative. He could not afford a luxury steak dinner, let alone a coastal estate. Keep digging, I instructed. He is funding an illusion somehow. Find the capital. Marcus initiated a deeper dive, deploying a proprietary tracing algorithm we typically reserved for tracking embezzled corporate funds. The screens shifted from banking data to expenditure tracking. That was when the horrifying scale of Brad's charade came into sharp focus. The algorithm bypassed standard privacy filters and pulled up recent major transactions linked to his name. A receipt for a custom diamond engagement ring from an exclusive jeweler in the Gold Coast district flashed onto the screen. The purchase price was $150,000. Marcus let out a low whistle. A ring like that requires proof of funds or a massive secured line of credit. It gets worse, I said, tracking the next data block. Below the jeweler receipt, a series of massive wire transfers populated the screen. A $75,000 non-refundable deposit to the Monterey estate for a weekend venue hold. Another $40,000 to a boutique event planning firm. $20,000 to a luxury auto dealership for a 12-month lease on a brand-new Aston Martin. He is hemorrhaging capital he does not possess, Marcus said, his fingers flying across the keys as he tried to trace the origin of the wire transfers. This is not just reckless spending. This is a deliberate, highly orchestrated financial facade. He is moving money through a secondary layer of obfuscation. I leaned closer to the monitors. Brad was not smart enough to build a financial cloaking network. He could barely figure out how to update his own smartphone operating system. He had to be utilizing a third-party loophole or an unsecured credit bridge. We hit a wall. A digital firewall sprang up on Marcus's screen, blocking the origin point of the massive wire transfers. The transactions were bouncing off a ghost account, a placeholder designed to mask the true source of the capital. He is hiding behind a mirrored credit profile, Marcus explained, his brow furrowing in frustration. The money is real, but the identity attached to the primary funding source is heavily shielded. Someone went through a lot of trouble to bury the paper trail. Give me a minute. I need to force a bypass through the routing numbers. The silence in the operations pit felt deafening as Marcus typed a rapid sequence of commands, executing a brute force decryption on the shielded routing data. We were treating my brother's finances with the exact same aggressive countermeasures we used against international cyber syndicates. For 3 long minutes, lines of code cascaded down the primary monitor. I watched the progress bar inch forward, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Had Brad borrowed money from dangerous people? Had he embezzled from his failing paper company? Had he manipulated our parents into taking out a second mortgage on their house? He was desperate enough to try anything, but accessing this level of funding required clean, verifiable assets. The progress bar hit 100%. The firewall shattered. The encrypted data unspooled across the screen, finally revealing the bedrock of Brad's entire fraudulent existence. The hidden line of credit materialized, an astronomical limit secured just 4 months prior, right around the time he started dating Jasmine. Marcus stopped typing. His hands dropped away from the keyboard. The ambient glow of the monitors cast a harsh, pale light over his face as he stared at the revealed documents. He sat perfectly still for a long moment, the quiet hum of the servers suddenly feeling incredibly loud. He expanded a single PDF document, attached to the core funding line, bringing it to the center of the display. He slowly turned his chair to look up at me. His expression was a mixture of absolute shock and professional horror. Camille Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual steady rhythm. He did not borrow money from dangerous people. He did not secure a loan under his own name. He did not use his own credit. He used yours. I stepped around the console and placed my hand on the back of his chair, my eyes locking onto the digitized documents glowing on the high-definition monitor. I leaned in my gaze, tracing the lines of encrypted text that Marcus had just forcefully unmasked. The cold, sterile light of the screen reflected the absolute betrayal staring back at me. Brad had not just stolen my identity. He had weaponized my past to fund his fraudulent future. The documents detailed a massive unsecured commercial line of credit totaling exactly $200,000. The origination date was 4 months ago, directly coinciding with the timeline of him meeting Jasmine Washington. To secure the funding, Brad had resurrected an old, inactive, limited liability company I had registered in my early 20s. It was a shell company I originally created for freelance tech support when I was still fixing broken laptops in our parents' basement. He had utilized my social security number, forged my signature on the digital origination forms, and leveraged the pristine, unblemished credit history I had spent the last decade painstakingly building. I watched Marcus pull up the ledger of expenditures tied to the fraudulent account. The money had been drained with terrifying speed. $150,000 had been wired directly to an exclusive Gold Coast jeweler. Jasmine was walking around with a diamond on her finger paid for by my stolen identity. The remaining $50,000 had been chopped into smaller wire transfers and funneled directly to a luxury event planning syndicate to secure the initial deposits for the wedding. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. When Brad was sneering at me across the table at the steakhouse, mocking my boutique startup, he was doing it while sitting on a mountain of my stolen credit. When he panicked about the dinner bill, it was because the fraudulent well had run completely dry. And when my parents summoned me this morning to demand my trust fund, it was not just a greedy power play. Brad needed that cash desperately to cover the massive monthly minimums on the stolen loan before the bank flagged it for fraud and the entire illusion collapsed. He was trying to use my own inheritance to pay off the debt he stole in my name. "Do I initiate a lockdown protocol?" Marcus asked, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "I have the direct lines for the Federal Cybercrime Division. This is felony identity theft and wire fraud. We can have his accounts frozen and federal agents at his front door before noon." I stared at the screen, my mind racing through the immediate consequences of making that call. If I reported him right now, the bank would freeze the assets. The wedding would be abruptly canceled. Brad would be arrested and the Washington family would be saved from his parasitic grift. But I knew exactly how my family operated. I knew the narrative my parents would instantly construct. "Hold off on the feds," I said, my voice eerily calm. Marcus turned his head, looking at me in disbelief. "Camille, he stole $200,000 from you. He committed a federal crime." "I know exactly what he did," I replied, stepping back and pacing the length of the operations pit. "But if I pull the trigger now, I lose the war. Thomas and Cynthia will immediately go into damage control. They will hire him the best defense lawyer in the state. They will paint me as the vindictive, jealous spinster sister who weaponized a simple financial misunderstanding to destroy her brother's happiness. They will tell everyone that I framed him to sabotage his marriage to the Washingtons. Brad will not be a criminal in their eyes. He will be a martyr, and I will be the villain who ruined the family legacy over money." I stopped pacing and looked back at the monitors. I am not going to let them control the narrative. If I am going to expose him, I need it to be so loud, so public, and so undeniably catastrophic that my parents cannot possibly spin it. I need Desmond Washington to see the rot for himself. Let Brad keep digging his own grave. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the cold logic of my strategy. What is our next vector? Pull up everything you can find on the wedding venue I ordered, the Monterey Estate. Brad was bragging to Desmond about securing it. He heavily implied he was purchasing the property, using it to match the Washington's level of generational wealth. Let us see exactly what he told them. Marcus brought up the vendor contracts and the initial deposits tied to my stolen credit line. The documents showed that Brad had not purchased anything. He had merely leased the Monterey estate through another convoluted shell company committing to exorbitant short-term rental fees to lock down the property for the wedding weekend. It was a spectacular waste of stolen money designed entirely to project an illusion of ownership. But as Marcus dug deeper into the commercial real estate databases to trace the property management firm handling the lease, he stopped typing. A confused frown creased his forehead. There is a massive discrepancy in the property records, Marcus said, rapidly opening new data windows. The firm Brad signed the lease with does not actually control the property anymore. Explain? I commanded, stepping closer to his chair. Marcus ran a real-time title search on the Monterey estate. The original owners went completely bankrupt last month. The bank formally foreclosed on the property 3 weeks ago. Brad signed a lease with a management company that no longer possessed the legal authority to rent the grounds. So who owns it now? I asked, watching the chain of custody update on the screen. The bank liquidated the asset at a private commercial real estate auction 48 hours ago, Marcus replied, highlighting the final transaction record. The winner of the auction was an anonymous corporate trust. I stared at the routing structure of the anonymous corporate trust displayed on the monitor. A strange, icy thrill washed over me. The acquisition identification numbers and the holding company architecture were intensely familiar. It was the exact routing structure my own firm used to discreetly acquire physical assets and secure off-grid server locations. Cross-reference that corporate trust ID with our internal real estate portfolio. I ordered, my heart beginning to pound with absolute clarity. Marcus opened a secure internal window and punched in the query. The database scanned for a fraction of a second before the match populated on the screen in bright green text. I looked at the property deed. My jaw slowly dropped as the universe handed me the ultimate weapon. I was the anonymous corporate buyer. I had authorized the acquisition of a coastal property 2 days ago to serve as a new secure data facility, completely unaware of its specific name or history. Brad was not just broke. He was not just a fraud. My brother was planning to throw his $200,000 stolen wedding on my property. I stared at the property deed glowing on the high-definition monitor. The sheer cosmic irony of the situation settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. Brad had stolen my identity to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle, and he was planning to host the crowning event of his fraudulent existence on a coastal estate that I legally owned. I did not need to involve the federal authorities to ruin him. I just needed to act like a landlord. Marcus watched me carefully from his swivel chair. He knew my expression. It was the exact look I had whenever our firm trapped a hostile hacker inside a closed server environment. I leaned over his keyboard and manipulated the mouse, capturing a precise high-resolution screenshot of the loan origination document. I made sure to frame the crucial details perfectly. The image clearly displayed Brad's IP, address, his digital signature, the date stamp, and my stolen social security number, sitting blatantly right next to his name. I transferred the image file to my secure mobile device. I opened my text message thread with my brother. Our previous messages were entirely one-sided, consisting mostly of his demanding rules regarding my wardrobe and behavior for his upcoming events. I did not type a single word of explanation or threat. I simply attached the image of the fraudulent loan document and hit send. I placed my phone face up on the cold glass of the desk and waited. Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. We both watched the screen. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence in the operations pit felt electric. I knew exactly what was happening miles away in our parents' suburban house. Brad was looking at his phone. His brain was desperately trying to process the image. The realization that his impenetrable secret was completely exposed was likely hitting his nervous system like a freight train. At exactly 47 seconds, my phone vibrated violently. Brad's name flashed across the display in bright, frantic letters. I let it ring twice before answering and immediately hitting the speakerphone button. Camille, his voice cracked instantly, sounding high-pitched and breathless. He was hyperventilating, pulling in ragged gasps of air. The swagger and arrogant entitlement from the steakhouse dinner were entirely gone. He sounded like a terrified child trapped in a dark room. I did not say hello. I simply let his panic fill the silent operations pit. "You have to listen to me," Brad begged, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a pathetic wet rush. "It is not what it looks like. I was going to pay it off before you ever found out. I just needed the bridge capital for a few weeks to secure the deposits. Jasmine will leave me if this gets out. Her father will absolutely destroy me. Desmond crushes people who cross him. He will ruin my life. Please, Camille, please let the wedding happen. I will pay you back every single cent. I swear on my life I will make it right." I listened to his desperate bargaining with absolute emotional detachment. He was not apologizing for stealing from me. He was apologizing for getting caught. He was only terrified of Desmond Washington discovering the truth. "Pay me back with what, Brad?" I asked, my voice deadly calm and perfectly level. "Are you planning to use your non-existent savings account? Or perhaps you plan to ask Thomas and Cynthia to take out a third mortgage on their house to cover your felony wire fraud? You do not have $200,000. You do not even have $2,000. "I can get it," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a sob. "I can get an advance on my salary. I can sell the car. Just do not call the cops. They will put me in federal prison." I leaned closer to the phone. "Let us talk about those 5 demands you emailed me last week. You explicitly laid out your terms for my existence in your life. You demanded I wear a cheap dress. You demanded I sit quietly in the back. You told me I was not worthy to stand beside you and Jasmine unless I stayed entirely invisible. You demanded that I hide my career, my success, and my true self so your fragile, fraudulent ego could shine. You wanted me to be nothing so you could pretend to be everything." I was stressed. Brad cried, actual tears thick in his throat. "I was so stressed about keeping up with the Washingtons. I was wrong. I am so sorry. Please, Camille, I am your brother." I let him sit in his own terror for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at Marcus, who raised an eyebrow, waiting for my final strike. "I am not going to call the police today, Brad," I said, letting the words hang in the air. A massive, shuddering gasp of relief echoed through the speaker. "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you, Camille. I am also not going to crash your wedding." I continued, my tone growing even colder. "In fact, I am going to give you exactly what you asked for. I accept your 5 conditions. I will stay completely away from you, your bride, and your new in-laws. I will be entirely invisible. Have a wonderful wedding day." Before he could utter another pathetic word of gratitude, I ended the call. The silence rushed back into the room. Brad currently believed he had just dodged total annihilation. He believed his tears had worked, that family loyalty had won, and that his coastal wedding was safe. He had absolutely no idea that I had just locked the doors to his cage. I picked up my phone and dialed a new number from my secure contacts list. My general counsel, Gavin, answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Camille." Gavin said, his voice brisk and professional. "What is the emergency, Gavin?" I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the property deed displayed on Marcus's monitor. "I need you to draft an immediate unconditional eviction notice for the commercial tenant currently holding the short-term lease on the Monterey estate." The new acquisition, Gavin asked, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. "Are we clearing the grounds for the server installation team?" "Exactly," I replied. "Have the notice served directly to the site manager by a uniformed courier before noon today. Inform them that the property is officially closed for private corporate renovations, effective immediately. Any scheduled events are officially canceled, and all non-essential personnel must vacate the premises." "Understood," Gavin replied without hesitation. "Consider the property locked down. Is there anything else?" "Yes," I said, a slow, sharp smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. "Contact my travel concierge. Book me a first-class ticket to Bali." The sound of the heavy brass zipper closing on my leather overnight bag was loud in the quiet isolation of my penthouse. I moved methodically around the massive master suite, collecting exactly what I needed for a prolonged absence. Designer sunglasses, a linen beach cover up my passport, and a secure offshore hardware wallet. My phone vibrated aggressively against the marble surface of the vanity. I did not need to guess who it was. I walked over and tapped the screen. The family group chat was active for the first time in months. Cynthia had sent a block of text followed immediately by Thomas. "Glad you finally realized you do not belong at this wedding," my mother wrote. "It is best for everyone if you just stay away and let your brother have his moment. You have always tried to cast a shadow over him, but not this time. Do not bother reaching out." Thomas chimed in right below her message. "Do not try to contact Desmond again. We are building a real future here, and Brad needs this clean break. Stay in your little tech bubble. Stay away." I did not reply. I simply locked the screen and dropped the phone into my handbag. They were so spectacularly confident in their victory. They had successfully bullied the unwanted, difficult daughter into submission, or so they thought. They genuinely believed I was retreating in shame, licking my wounds after being banished from the social event of the decade. They had absolutely no idea they were marching blindly onto a battlefield I already controlled. The private elevator chimed, signaling an arrival. My general counsel Gavin stepped into the foyer carrying a thick locked leather briefcase. He looked immaculate, sharp, and perfectly prepared for the legal execution we were about to orchestrate. I led him into the formal dining room, where a single elegant crimson-red gift box sat waiting on the dark wood table. It looked exactly like a premium wedding present, the kind of box that typically contained crystal champagne flutes or imported silver serving trays. Instead, we were filling it with total devastation. Gavin unlocked his briefcase and pulled the documents out one by one, laying them flat on the table. We reviewed them together, ensuring every piece of the trap was flawless. First went the certified copies of the fraudulent loan origination forms, displaying Brad's digital signature right next to my stolen Social Security number. Second was the forensic financial trace Marcus had run, highlighting the exact wire transfers from the stolen account to the wedding vendors and the Gold Coast jeweler. The paper trail was undeniable. Next came the piece de resistance. Gavin handed me the certified property deed for the Monterey estate. The heavy watermarked paper clearly listed my corporate trust as the sole legal owner of the sprawling coastal property. Finally, he handed me the immediate eviction notice. It was drafted with brutal, airtight legal precision, ordering all unauthorized personnel to vacate the premises instantly under threat of criminal trespassing charges. I aligned the stack of papers, ensuring the edges were perfectly flush, and placed them inside the crimson box. I closed the lid. I struck a match and held a stick of deep burgundy sealing wax over the seam, letting the hot liquid pool onto the cardboard. I pressed my heavy brass corporate signet ring firmly into the wax. The seal hardened instantly, locking the cold, hard truth inside. The drive to the international terminal was smooth and quiet. We sat in the back of the tinted town car, watching the city skyline blur past us. I handed the heavy crimson box to Gavin. He took it with both hands, fully understanding the absolute gravity of the package he was holding. "You know exactly when to deliver this," I said, making sure my instructions were perfectly clear. Gavin nodded, his expression completely serious. "I arrive at the Monterey estate exactly 10 minutes before the ceremony is scheduled to begin. I bypass the event planners, the security, and the ushers. I hand this directly to Desmond Washington. I inform him it is a priority hand-delivered message from the actual legal owner of the property." Not a minute earlier, I instructed, leaning back against the leather seat. "I want Brad standing at the altar. I want Jasmine in her designer dress. I want my parents sitting in the front row, completely surrounded by high society, fully believing they have won the ultimate prize. Let them taste the absolute pinnacle of their fake triumph before you hand Desmond the detonator. I will make sure he opens it personally." Gavin assured me, a grim professional smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Have a wonderful trip, Camille." I navigated through the first-class priority line and settled into my private suite on the aircraft. The flight attendant offered me a glass of vintage champagne before takeoff. I accepted it, the cool crystal feeling grounding and real in my hand. As the heavy engines roared to life and the plane banked upward, breaking through the cloud cover into the bright morning sky, I pulled my secure tablet from my carry-on bag. I connected to the in-flight encrypted network and opened the proprietary surveillance application my cybersecurity team had installed at all our corporate physical properties. I punched in my administrative credentials, bypassed the two-factor authentication, and selected the newly acquired Monterey estate from the drop-down menu. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second before a grid of 12 high-definition, closed-circuit camera feeds populated the display. The video was crystal clear. I took a slow sip of my champagne and watched my screen in absolute fascination. Down on the manicured, sprawling lawns of the coastal property, a small army of florists, caterers, and event coordinators were rushing around like frantic ants. They were erecting massive white silk event tents, arranging thousands of imported white roses along the stone walkways, and setting up rows of golden chairs facing the crashing ocean waves. A catering crew was busy unloading crates of premium liquor and tiered wedding cakes near the main house. I tapped the screen, zooming in on the camera positioned near the wrought iron front gates. Brad was standing there in a casual, custom-tailored suit he absolutely could not afford. He was aggressively pointing out directions to a confused delivery driver, waving his arms with total authority. He looked so incredibly arrogant, so entirely in control of a world he did not own and a life he had stolen. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, resting my champagne glass on the armrest. Thousands of miles above the earth, I watched my brother excitedly orchestrate his massive, fraudulent wedding directly on my front lawn. The cosmic irony of the situation settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. Brad had not just stolen my identity to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle, he was planning to host the crowning event of his fraudulent existence on a coastal estate that I legally owned. I did not need to involve the federal authorities to ruin him right now. I just needed to act like a landlord. Before he could utter another pathetic word of gratitude, I ended the call. The silence rushed back into the room. Brad currently believed he had just dodged total annihilation. He believed his tears had worked, that family loyalty had won out over federal law, and that his luxurious coastal wedding was safe. He had absolutely no idea that I had just locked the doors to his cage and swallowed the key. I picked up my phone and dialed a new number from my secure contacts list. My general counsel, Gavin, answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Camille." Gavin said, his voice brisk and professional. "What is the emergency, Gavin?" I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the property deed displayed on the main monitor. "I need you to draft an immediate unconditional eviction notice for the commercial tenant currently holding the short-term lease on the Monterey estate." "The new coastal acquisition?" Gavin asked, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. "Are we clearing the grounds for the server installation team?" "Exactly," I replied. "Have the notice served directly to the site manager by a uniformed courier before noon today. Inform them that the property is officially closed for private corporate renovations, effective immediately. Any scheduled events are officially canceled, and all non-essential personnel must vacate the premises." "Understood," Gavin replied without hesitation. "Consider the property locked down. Is there anything else?" "Yes," I said, a slow, sharp smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. "Book me a first-class ticket to Bali." 24 hours later, the dull roar of the aircraft engines had been replaced by the rhythmic, soothing sound of the Indian Ocean crashing against the limestone cliffs of Uluwatu. The tropical sun beat down from a cloudless sky, casting a brilliant glare over the jungle canopy. I slid deeper into the warm, crystalline water of my private infinity pool, letting the water lap at my collarbones. I reached for the frosted glass resting on the stone ledge, taking a slow sip of a perfectly mixed margarita. The salt on the rim was sharp and grounding. Propped up on a dry towel inches from the water was my iPad Pro. The screen was divided into a flawless grid of high-definition security feeds streaming live from the Monterey estate. Because I had purchased the property to serve as a discreet, high-security corporate data facility, the previous owners had already installed a military-grade surveillance matrix. There were hidden directional microphones in the gardens, motion tracking cameras concealed in the eaves of the main house, and crystal-clear audio-visual coverage of every square foot of the grounds. From the serene isolation of Bali, I possessed a godlike view of the exact moment my family prepared to crown themselves as royalty. I tapped the screen, bringing the feed from the central rose garden into full view. The audio synced instantly, the directional microphones filtering out the ocean breeze to capture the conversation with terrifying clarity. My parents were strolling down the manicured stone pathway, holding flutes of vintage champagne that Brad had undoubtedly purchased using my stolen credit line. Thomas was wearing a bespoke linen suit, his chest puffed out as he surveyed the massive white event tents being erected by the catering staff. Cynthia was walking beside him, criticizing the floral arrangements to a terrified-looking wedding planner. They looked entirely comfortable in a world they had not earned, projecting an aura of generational wealth that was entirely fabricated. I switched the feed to the south terrace. Brad was standing by the stone balustrade looking out over the crashing waves. He looked tense, constantly checking his phone. I knew exactly why. He was waiting for the bank to freeze his accounts, or for the police to arrive, or for me to exact some sort of immediate explosive revenge. He was terrified, but he was holding it together, playing the role of the confident young tycoon about to marry into a dynasty. A moment later, Jasmine stepped onto the terrace. She looked breathtaking in a simple white sundress, her posture radiating natural, unforced elegance. She walked up to Brad and placed a gentle hand on his arm. The hidden microphone above the terrace doors picked up their voices perfectly. "Are you all right?" Jasmine asked, her brow furrowing with genuine concern. "You have been checking your phone all morning. Is everything okay with the vendors?" Brad forced a wide, blindingly fake smile. "Everything is perfect, babe. I am just making sure the logistics team is executing the timeline. I want this weekend to be flawless for you." Jasmine did not immediately return the smile. She looked around the sprawling estate, then back to Brad. "Have you heard from Camille? I know you said she was not coming, but it feels wrong not to have your sister here. We could fly her out? My father has the jet on standby." Brad's jaw tightened. The mention of my name caused a micro-expression of pure panic to flash across his face, but he quickly buried it beneath a mask of performative pity. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and looked down at his shoes. "I tried, Jasmine." Brad lied, his voice dripping with condescending sorrow. "I really did. But Camille was too ashamed of her financial situation to come. She has been struggling with her little startup for years, and being around your family, it just makes her feel inadequate. She told me she could not bear the embarrassment. It is sad, but we have to focus on us. We cannot let her insecurities ruin our weekend." I took another sip of my margarita, the ice clinking softly against the glass. It was a masterful lie designed to paint me as a pathetic, jealous failure, while simultaneously casting him as the long-suffering, supportive brother. But Jasmine Washington was not a fool. She was the daughter of a self-made titan raised in boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. She possessed a terrifyingly high emotional intelligence, and I watched through the camera lens as her instincts registered the absolute rot in Brad's statement. Jasmine took a slow step back, dropping her hand from his arm. Her expression shifted from gentle concern to quiet, analytical scrutiny. She did not argue with him, and she did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him as if she were seeing a stranger. "That is a terrible thing to say about your own blood," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a cool, flat register. "I'm going to check on the seating arrangements." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Brad standing alone on the terrace, his fake smile slowly melting into a scowl of frustration. I switched cameras, tracking Jasmine as she moved swiftly through the main house. She bypassed the wedding planners and the caterers, her face set in a hard, determined line. She walked directly into the grand library where her father, Desmond Washington, was sitting behind a massive oak desk, reviewing a stack of corporate contracts. Desmond looked up as his daughter entered. Even through the security feed, the man radiated quiet, lethal authority. He closed his file and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" Jazzy Desmond asked, his deep voice carrying easily to the hidden microphone. Jasmine closed the heavy mahogany doors behind her, ensuring they were completely alone. She walked over to the desk and crossed her arms. "Something is not right, Dad," Jasmine said, her voice tight with unease. "Brad just made a comment about his sister. He said she was too ashamed of her finances to attend, and he seemed almost happy about it. He dismissed her like she was garbage. It was cold. Successful people do not talk about their family like this. People who actually build wealth do not act this desperate to prove they belong." Desmond did not dismiss her concerns. He did not tell her it was just pre-wedding jitters. He leaned back in his leather chair, his dark eyes narrowing as he processed her words. He trusted his daughter's intuition implicitly. "You think he is hiding something," Desmond stated, rather than asked. "I think he is playing a role," Jasmine replied, holding her father's gaze. "And I think we need to know exactly who he really is before I walk down that aisle tomorrow." Desmond Washington gave a slow, deliberate nod. He reached across the desk and picked up his mobile phone. "Go back to the guests, Jasmine. Let me handle this." Jasmine nodded and slipped out of the library, leaving Desmond alone. I watched in absolute silence from the infinity pool in Bali as Desmond dialed a number. He waited a few seconds for the connection to establish. "Get me Harrison," Desmond ordered, his voice echoing with cold, unforgiving power. "I need a full deep dive background check on Brad. I want his financials, his corporate filings, his tax records, and I want everything you can find on his sister Camille. I want to know exactly where his money is coming from. Pull a team together right now. You have 4 hours." Desmond hung up the phone and stared out the library window, his expression hardening into stone. I locked my iPad screen and set it down on the towel. I leaned back into the warm water and looked up at the vibrant blue sky. The trap was set, the cameras were rolling, and the absolute destruction of Brad's fraudulent life had officially begun. The scent of crushed jasmine and sandalwood filled the warm tropical air. I lay face down on a padded mahogany massage table inside my private open-air pavilion in Bali. The rhythmic sound of the Indian Ocean, crashing against the limestone cliffs below, provided a soothing soundtrack to my morning. A masseuse worked warm, spiced oil into my shoulders, kneading away the residual tension of a 30-hour flight. Propped up on a bamboo stand, directly in my line of sight, was my iPad. The screen was divided into a grid displaying the high-definition security feeds from the Monterey estate. Half a world away, the morning sun was just beginning to burn the coastal fog off my property. I watched Brad through the camera, concealed inside the master suite's ornate crown molding. He was standing in front of a gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror, admiring his reflection. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that cost more than his car. He adjusted his silk bow tie with deliberate, practiced movements, jutting his chin out and running a hand over his perfectly styled hair. He looked exactly like the man he had always pretended to be, a titan of industry, a self-made king. He shot his cuffs, flashing a pair of heavy platinum cufflinks, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing inside a house he did not own, wearing clothes purchased with a fraudulent line of credit, and being watched by the sister he thought he had successfully banished. Brad picked up his phone, likely checking his bank apps or waiting for a congratulatory text from Thomas and Cynthia. My parents were undoubtedly roaming the grounds, sipping mimosas, and bragging to anyone who would listen about their son, the billionaire. Brad slid the phone into his pocket and took a deep, satisfied breath. He believed he had won. He believed his pathetic, tearful phone call had neutralized me, and that his path to the Washington fortune was entirely clear. The heavy oak door of the master suite swung open. Jasmine stepped into the room. She was breathtaking. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of embroidered ivory silk, cascading around her in a flawless silhouette. But as I watched her through the high-definition feed, I focused entirely on her face. There was no bridal joy in her expression. There were no nervous, happy tears. Her dark eyes were perfectly still, calculating and sharp. She looked like a judge stepping into a courtroom. Brad turned away from the mirror. His face instantly broke into a massive, adoring smile. He closed the distance between them, reaching out to take her hands. "You look absolutely incredible," he said, his voice dripping with practiced charm. The audio feed picked up his words with crystal clarity. I am the luckiest man on earth. Jasmine did not return his smile. She let him hold her hands, but her body language remained rigid. She looked up at him, her gaze piercing right through his carefully constructed facade. Brad, she said, her voice quiet but carrying a heavy, undeniable weight. Before we do this, before we walk out there in front of my family and 400 guests, I need to ask you one final time. Brad's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted across her face, searching for a clue. Ask me what, baby? Is there anything you are hiding from me? Jasmine asked, her tone completely even devoid of any accusatory inflection. She was giving him a rope. It was his choice whether to climb it or hang himself with it. About your sister? About your finances? About anything at all? Tell me the truth right now, Brad. I stopped breathing in Bali. I watched my brother stand at the precipice of his own destruction. If he possessed a single ounce of genuine integrity, he would have collapsed and confessed. He would have told her about the stolen identity, the fake lease, the lies. But Brad was a narcissist to his very core. He simply could not compute the idea of surrendering his illusion. Brad let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. He reached up and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind Jasmine's ear. His performance was terrifyingly flawless. Jasmine, we talked about this. I told you Camille has her own struggles. She is bitter and she is resentful of our success. It breaks my heart that she could not be here today, but I cannot let her toxic energy ruin our life. He leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. As for my finances, everything is perfectly handled. You never have to worry about a thing. It is just you and me, baby. My family is a mess, but we are perfect. Jasmine stood perfectly still. She absorbed his lie. She absorbed the absolute confirmation of his sociopathy. She had seen the files her father had shown her. She knew exactly what Brad had done to me, and she had just given him the chance to be a man. He had chosen to remain a parasite. Okay, Jasmine said. A single flat word. She stepped back, breaking contact with him. I will see you out there. She turned and walked out of the master suite, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The camera in the grand hallway picked her up instantly. The moment the door clicked shut, the bridal softness completely vanished from her posture. Her face hardened into pure, unforgiving steel. She walked down the long corridor with the measured, predatory stride of a woman who knew exactly how to destroy an enemy. Desmond Washington was waiting for her at the top of the grand staircase. He wore a pristine tuxedo, his broad shoulders squared, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked less like a father giving away a bride and more like a general preparing for an execution. Jasmine stopped in front of him. They did not speak. They did not need to. Jasmine simply looked her father in the eye and gave a single definitive nod. Desmond nodded back. The verdict was sealed. Down on the coastal lawn, the string quartet began to play. The sweeping, elegant notes of the wedding march drifted through the estate grounds, signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests turned their attention toward the aisle, completely unaware of the absolute carnage that was about to unfold. In Bali, I reached for my margarita and took a long, satisfying sip. A soft chime from my encrypted satellite phone broke the quiet of my private pavilion. I picked it up. A single text message glowed on the screen from Desmond Washington. The trap is set. I set the satellite phone face down on the bamboo table, the glowing screen reflecting off the surface of my margarita. The trap is set. Desmond Washington was a man of his word. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the grid of high-definition surveillance feeds streaming live from the Monterey estate. The coastal lawn was a breathtaking display of stolen opulence. 400 of Chicago and Monterey's most elite figures sat in gilded chairs, their designer clothes rustling in the gentle ocean breeze. Thousands of imported white roses framed the aisle leading up to a massive floral arch, framing the crashing waves of the Pacific. It was the social event of the season, a wedding of the decade entirely built on a foundation of my stolen identity. I zoomed in on camera 4, positioned directly on the front row. My parents sat there practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. Thomas had his chest puffed out so far his custom vest looked ready to burst. He was leaning over, whispering loudly to the venture capitalist seated beside him, pointing proudly at Brad. Cynthia was dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. The directional audio feed caught her voice perfectly over the low murmur of the crowd. "It is just so perfect," Cynthia whispered to Thomas, a venomous edge underlying her maternal pride. Thank God Camille finally realized she did not belong here. Can you imagine the scene she would have caused? Brad deserves this day all to himself, without her dragging him down. Thomas patted her hand, a greedy gleam in his eye. She is sitting in her little apartment right now knowing she lost. Brad is marrying into the Washington dynasty. We have arrived, Cynthia. We finally have real power. I did not feel a trace of anger watching them. Their absolute delusion only made the impending detonation sweeter. At the altar, Brad stood tall, adjusting his cuffs. The midday sun caught the platinum links he had charged to my corporate account. He flashed a brilliant practice smile to the crowd. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought his tearful phone call had neutralized me, completely unaware that he was standing on my property, waiting for a bride who already knew his deepest secrets. The string quartet transitioned into a slow, hauntingly beautiful bridal march. The guests stood in unison. Jasmine Washington appeared at the top of the stone pathway. She was a vision in ivory silk, but her demeanor was terrifying. She did not glide down the aisle like a joyful bride. She marched. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her head held high, and her dark eyes were completely devoid of warmth. She looked like a queen walking toward a guillotine. As she reached the altar, Brad stepped forward, his face arranged in an expression of overwhelming love. He reached for her hands. Jasmine allowed him to take her fingertips, but she maintained a cold physical distance. Her eyes flicked briefly to the front row, locking onto her father. Desmond Washington sat completely still, his face a mask of stone. He gave his daughter a single microscopic nod. The officiant, a distinguished man with a booming, resonant voice, raised his hands to quiet the crowd. The guests settled back into their gilded chairs, the rustle of expensive fabric fading into the sound of the ocean waves. "We are gathered here today." The officiant began, his voice echoing through the hidden microphones into my pavilion in Bali, to witness the union of Brad and Jasmine. Marriage is not merely a contract. It is a profound commitment built on the unbreakable pillars of honesty, transparency, and legacy. Brad nodded solemnly, his face a picture of pious agreement. The absolute hypocrisy was staggering. A true partnership cannot survive in the shadows. The officiant continued his words, carrying a heavy, unintentional irony that made me smile into my empty glass. It requires two people to stand before their families, their community, and the world, and offer their authentic selves. A foundation built on truth is the only foundation that will endure the tests of time. Jasmine stared straight ahead, her jaw tightly clenched. She did not look at Brad. She looked at the horizon, waiting for the precise moment her father had promised. "Before we proceed with the vows that will bind this man and this woman together," the officiant said, taking a dramatic pause and looking out over the sea of wealthy guests, "it is required that I ask. If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." The traditional pause followed. It was supposed to be a formality. A few seconds of respectful silence before the romantic vows began. My parents beamed, their eyes fixed on their golden boy. But the silence stretched. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. Then the sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy leather shoes striking the stone pathway echoed across the lawn. I leaned closer to the iPad screen, watching as the crowd turned in unison. A man stepped directly into the center aisle. He was dressed in a razor-sharp black suit, his posture rigid and authoritative. It was Gavin, my general counsel. Following Desmond Washington's brilliant sense of timing, Gavin had bypassed the security perimeter perfectly. He stood dead center in the aisle, clutching a thick, legally sealed envelope in one hand and the crimson-red box in the other. The man in the sharp black suit moved with the precise, unhurried cadence of a predator. He stepped onto the pristine white runner of the center aisle, his dark leather shoes striking the fabric with a heavy, rhythmic thud that cut straight through the delicate melodies of the string quartet. In my private pavilion in Bali, I leaned forward, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of my tablet. I tapped the screen, switching the primary feed to the camera mounted directly above the floral arch. The aerial view captured the entire magnificent disaster in breathtaking detail. The 400 elite guests sat frozen in their gilded chairs. A ripple of absolute shock swept through the crowd, turning heads and sparking furious, hushed whispers. This was a high society wedding, orchestrated to the finest degree, and the sudden intrusion of an uninvited man carrying a sealed package was a catastrophic breach of protocol. Brad saw him first. Even through the digital feed, I could see the exact second the blood drained completely from my brother's face. His forced, charismatic smile shattered, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what that crimson-red box meant. He recognized the burgundy wax seal from across the lawn. It was the physical manifestation of the trap I had promised not to spring, arriving precisely when it would inflict the maximum amount of devastation. Down in the front row, Thomas finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. My father had spent his entire life playing the role of a powerful patriarch, dominating weak people and hiding behind my mother's aggressive social maneuvering. He saw his golden boy's perfect moment being threatened, and his instinct to protect his fraudulent legacy overrode his common sense. Thomas stood up abruptly, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He stepped out of his row aggressively, raising a hand to signal the event staff intending to physically intercept the courier before he could reach the altar. He never even made it past the second row of chairs. Desmond Washington had not become a billionaire by leaving variables to chance. He had given his daughter a promise, and he had deployed his resources accordingly. Before Thomas could take another step toward the center aisle, three massive men in tailored navy suits materialized from the periphery of the guest seating. They moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. Desmond's private security detail did not shove my father or make a scene. They simply formed an impenetrable wall of solid muscle and bespoke fabric, smoothly stepping into the aisle and completely blocking Thomas' path. "Excuse me." Thomas sputtered, his voice cracking with a mixture of indignation and sudden fear. "Do you know who I am? I am the father of the groom. Move out of my way right now." The security guards did not blink. They did not speak. They simply stood there staring down at my father with blank professional indifference. Thomas bumped against the chest of the lead guard and practically bounced off his illusion of authority, evaporating in an instant. He was a small, loud man, realizing he had walked into a room full of actual titans. Unimpeded, the courier continued his march down the aisle. He reached the altar, bypassing the stunned officiant and completely ignoring the frantic whispering of the bridesmaids. He stopped precisely 2 feet in front of Brad. Jasmine Washington did not flinch. She stood beside her trembling groom, her posture radiating absolute regal authority. Her dark eyes locked onto the courier, tracking his every movement with cold, analytical precision. She was entirely prepared for this detonation. The courier lifted the heavy crimson-red box, holding it out with both hands. The sunlight caught the deep burgundy wax and the impression of my corporate signet ring. "A wedding gift from the owner of this estate," the courier announced loudly. His voice was projected perfectly, carrying across the silent lawn and echoing through the directional microphone straight into my earpiece. The words hit the crowd like a shockwave. A collective gasp rose from the seated guests. They were the social elite of Chicago and Monterey people who understood the brutal nuances of power and ownership. The implication of the courier's statement was instantly clear to everyone listening. If the owner of the estate was sending a gift, then the man standing at the altar did not own the ground he was standing on. In the front row, Cynthia lost whatever remained of her fragile grip on reality. Her pristine social image was cracking wide open in front of the most powerful people she had ever met. She could not process the fact that her carefully constructed narrative was being dismantled on a live stage. She leaped to her feet, her face contorted in absolute fury. "Brad owns this estate." Cynthia shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, shattering the last remnants of wedding decorum. Get this man out of here right now, security. Someone call the police. He is ruining my son's wedding. Her outburst echoed across the manicured lawns, a pathetic display of a woman desperately clinging to a lie. She pointed a trembling finger at the courier, fully expecting someone to rush forward and validate her delusion. Instead, Desmond Washington stood up. The patriarch of the Washington family did not rush. He buttoned his suit jacket, stepped around the frozen form of his new son-in-law, and walked directly up the steps of the altar. The air around him seemed to crackle with heavy, suffocating authority. He reached out and smoothly took the microphone from the trembling hands of the officiant. "No, Cynthia," Desmond said, his voice booming over the sound system, cold, resonant, and dripping with absolute command. "Let him open it. I insist." The command echoed over the ocean waves. Desmond turned his dark, unforgiving gaze entirely onto Brad. He was not asking. He was ordering the execution to proceed. I leaned back against the wet stone of the infinity pool, my heart beating in a steady, victorious rhythm. The camera zoomed in tightly on the altar. Brad was trapped. He was completely surrounded by the reality of his own actions. There was no escape, no lie left to tell, and no mother to hide behind. Brad reached out. His hands were visibly shaking, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely grip the edges of the cardboard. He stared at the crimson-red box as if it were a live explosive. With a slow, agonizing pull, Brad broke the wax seal. The thick, burgundy wax cracked with a sharp snap that felt louder than the crashing Pacific waves behind the altar. In my private pavilion in Bali, I watched the high-definition feed with absolute focus, savoring every microsecond of the impending destruction. Brad's perfectly manicured fingers, slick with sudden nervous sweat, fumbled with the heavy flap of the crimson box. He was breathing erratically, his chest heaving under his custom-tailored tuxedo. The 400 guests seated on the coastal lawn remained perfectly silent, completely captivated by the bizarre disruption of the ceremony. Brad reached inside the box. He pulled out two oversized, heavily laminated documents. The rigid plastic caught the harsh California sunlight, reflecting a glare that made him squint. As he unfolded them, the high-resolution camera above the floral arch allowed me to read the bold black print perfectly. The first document was the fraud docket. It detailed exactly $200,000 in illicit credit lines. Right there, magnified and undeniable, was his forged signature. It was the absolute legal proof of his crime, staring him directly in the face. The second document was the immediate eviction notice. It cited unauthorized trespassing on private property, specifically the very estate where he currently stood pretending to be a self-made billionaire. And there, at the absolute bottom of the page, signed in heavy, unapologetic bold ink, was my name, Camille. The realization hit Brad like a physical blow to the stomach. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking hollow, sickly, and utterly terrified. His knees buckled slightly. His hands began to shake with such violent intensity that he could no longer maintain his grip. Brad dropped the papers as if they were literally on fire. The heavy laminated sheets hit the pristine white stone of the altar with a sharp, echoing slap. The sound broke the spell, holding the crowd hostage. The 400 elite guests, previously frozen in confusion, began to murmur. The whispers started in the front rows and spread like a brush fire all the way to the back of the lawn. It was a chaotic rising tide of shocked gasps and frantic questioning. The social elite of Chicago and Monterey were watching a golden boy unravel in real time, and the scent of scandal was intoxicating. Brad stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the white runner. He bumped into the massive floral arch, nearly sending a cascade of white roses tumbling to the ground. He looked wildly at Desmond Washington, then at Jasmine, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was a cornered animal, stripped of his lies, standing entirely exposed before the people he had tried to conquer. Down in the front row, the murmurs of the crowd acted as a spark on dry kindling for my mother. Cynthia could not process the reality unfolding in front of her. Her mind, deeply entrenched in years of delusion and superiority, violently rejected the scene. She broke the invisible barrier of wedding decorum and lunged forward. She scrambled up the stone steps of the altar, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the stone. Cynthia fell to her knees, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place as she aggressively grabbed the fallen papers. She yanked them off the ground, her eyes darting wildly across the legal text. Denial contorted her features into an ugly, desperate mask. She shot back up to her feet, waving the laminated documents aggressively toward the murmuring crowd. "This is a lie," Cynthia screamed. Her voice was shrill, cracking with panic, completely shattering the elegant atmosphere of the coastal estate. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the courier, then out toward the sea of bewildered guests. "She is a jealous, poor IT worker. She faked this. My son is a billionaire." Her outburst was a pathetic, frantic attempt to glue the shattered pieces of her perfect narrative back together. She genuinely expected the crowd to rally behind her to validate her delusion and cast the intruder out. Thomas stood frozen in the front row, his face a pale mask of confusion, entirely unable to back up his wife's hysterical claims. Desmond Washington did not flinch at the screaming woman invading his daughter's altar. He moved with the slow, terrifying calm of an apex predator closing its jaws. He stepped smoothly in front of Cynthia, completely ignoring her frantic waving of the eviction notice. He adjusted his grip on the microphone, his broad shoulders squaring as he looked out over the sea of guests. When Desmond spoke, his deep, commanding voice boomed over the sound system, easily overpowering my mother's shrill denials and instantly silencing the murmuring crowd. "She is the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm," Desmond announced. The words hit the lawn like a physical shockwave. A collective, deafening gasp rose from the 400 guests. In my pavilion, I took a slow sip of my margarita, letting the absolute perfection of the moment wash over me. "Your son stole her identity to buy my daughter's ring." Desmond continued, his voice dripping with icy contempt, and leased a foreclosed property to pretend he was rich. Cynthia stumbled backward as if she had been struck. The papers slipped from her hands, once again fluttering to the ground. Her mouth hung open, but no words came out. The absolute, unshakable authority of Desmond Washington had crushed her final desperate lie into dust. Thomas sank slowly into his chair in the front row, burying his face in his hands as the reality of their complete and utter destruction finally set in. Brad remained pinned against the floral arch, paralyzed by fear and public humiliation. He turned his desperate, pleading eyes toward his bride, silently begging for a lifeline that was never going to come. Jasmine Washington turned to face him. Her posture was completely relaxed, but her eyes were lethal. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She calmly reached over to her left hand. With smooth, deliberate precision, Jasmine took off the massive, fraudulent diamond engagement ring. She held the glittering stone between her thumb and forefinger, looking at Brad with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You thought you could buy my family's legacy with stolen money?" Jasmine asked. Her voice was quiet, but the microphones picked it up perfectly, broadcasting her cold disdain to every single person in attendance. She did not wait for his answer. Jasmine extended her hand over the open crimson-red box resting on the altar. She opened her fingers. The stolen diamond fell, landing inside the box with a heavy, definitive thud. The heavy thud of this diamond ring hitting the bottom of the crimson box sounded like a gavel striking a wooden block. Jasmine Washington did not shed a single tear. She wiped her hands together in a swift, dismissive motion, as if physically dusting off a layer of grime. She turned her back on the trembling figure of the man she had almost married. Sweeping her dark, commanding gaze over the sea of 400 paralyzed guests, she raised her chin. Her voice, completely level and amplified by the altar microphones, cut through the salty ocean air with surgical precision. "There will be no wedding today." The crowd gasped in unison, a visible wave of shock rippling through the rows of gilded chairs. Jasmine gestured elegantly toward the massive white reception tents lining the cliffside. "Please enjoy the catering," she instructed, her tone perfectly flat. "It is already paid for." Fraudulently, but paid for. Without another glance at the shattered illusion at the altar, she linked her arm firmly through her father's. Desmond Washington squared his shoulders, a look of grim satisfaction settling on his face. Together, they descended the stone steps. They walked back down the pristine white runner, parting the sea of stunned billionaires, venture capitalists and socialites with the quiet dignity of royalty, abandoning a ruined, infected kingdom. Behind them, the last remaining threads of the illusion snapped. Brad's knees completely gave out. He collapsed onto the hard stone of the altar, his custom-tailored trousers soaking up the spilled water from a knocked-over arrangement of white roses. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving, as loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobs tore from his throat. He was no longer the confident, self-made titan of industry. He was a terrified, exposed trespasser waiting for his inevitable punishment. Seeing their golden boy completely broken, Thomas and Cynthia snapped into a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. The reality of their permanent social obliteration and absolute financial ruin hit them simultaneously. They scrambled over the fallen chairs in the front row, rushing the altar in a frantic, undignified display of desperation. "Desmond Jasmine, wait!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice hoarse and completely lacking its usual practiced refinement. She clawed at the air, trying to grab Desmond's sleeve as he walked past the first row. "Please. This is a massive misunderstanding. Brad is a good man. We can fix this." Thomas practically threw himself into the center aisle, his face flushed with sweat and absolute terror, trying to physically block their exit. "Desmond, be reasonable. We can make a deal. Do not walk away from us." Desmond did not even break his stride. He gave a single microscopic nod. Instantly, his massive private security guards stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and dark fabric. They effortlessly shoved Thomas and Cynthia aside, leaving my parents stumbling backward onto the manicured grass, weeping, grasping at straws and begging for a mercy they absolutely did not deserve. The chaotic chorus of my parents' pathetic pleading, Brad's loud sobbing, and the frantic, scandalized whispering of 400 guests suddenly shifted. A new sound pierced the heavy coastal air. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail cutting through the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific waves against the limestone cliffs. Within seconds, the noise multiplied and amplified, growing exponentially louder. Sirens. The sharp, aggressive blare of law enforcement vehicles echoed down the coastal highway, moving at high speed directly toward the estate. The murmurs of the crowd turned into genuine alarm as the harsh realization set in. This was not just a dramatically canceled social event. This was an active crime scene. Half a world away, the warm Balinese breeze rustled the palm leaves above my private open-air pavilion. I picked up my margarita, the rim perfectly crusted with salt, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. My eyes never left the glowing grid of the iPad screen propped up on the bamboo stand. I tapped the display, switching the main high-definition feed from the weeping figures at the altar to the security cameras mounted at the main gates of the Monterey estate. The heavy wrought iron gates were wide open. A fleet of black and white police cruisers came tearing up the long, winding driveway, their tires aggressively kicking up dirt and gravel. The flashing red and blue lights painted the pristine coastal landscaping in harsh, frantic strobe-like colors. The vehicles slammed to a halt directly on the edge of the manicured lawn. Doors flew open in unison. Uniformed officers stepped out, their faces stern and determined, metal handcuffs already unholstered and gleaming brightly in the California sun. The officers did not hesitate. They moved in a tight, synchronized formation, their heavy black boots trampling over the scattered white rose petals that lined the center aisle. The visual contrast was jarring. Heavily armed law enforcement officers cutting straight through a sea of horrified venture capitalists, tech billionaires, and socialites in bespoke suits and designer gowns. The guests scrambled out of the way, pulling their chairs back, whispering furiously as the reality of the raid set in. Cell phones were already being pulled out. The social elite of Chicago and Monterey were merciless, and they were documenting every second of the spectacular downfall. At the altar, Brad remained exactly where he had collapsed. He was on his knees in a puddle of water from the overturned floral arrangement, his expensive tuxedo soaked and ruined. He did not even try to run. There was nowhere left to go. The lead detective, a tall man with a weathered face and zero patience for high society theatrics, marched straight up the stone steps. Bradley Washington. The detective barked, his voice echoing across the silent lawn. Or should I say, Bradley Monterey. You are under arrest for felony identity theft, wire fraud, grand larceny, and trespassing. Brad let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail. He raised his hands, shaking violently, but he offered no resistance. The detective grabbed Brad's wrists, pulling his arms behind his back with practiced, ungentle efficiency. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut over Brad's wrists echoed over the crashing ocean waves. It was the definitive sound of the golden child's reign coming to a permanent, humiliating end. No! The shrill scream tore through the coastal air. Cynthia, having recovered from her momentary shock, launched herself toward the altar like a deranged woman. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess. Her makeup was streaked with tears and sweat. She scrambled up the stone steps, completely ignoring the sheer indignity of her actions, and threw herself toward the officers holding her son. "You cannot do this!" Cynthia screamed, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. She clawed at the air, her eyes wild with a terrifying mixture of denial and rage. "Let him go. He is a good boy. He did nothing wrong. His sister did this to him out of spite. She is a jealous, poor IT worker who wants to ruin his life. Camille set this whole thing up." The lead detective did not even blink. He stepped smoothly in front of Brad, blocking my mother completely. He dropped his hand to his utility belt, his posture instantly shifting from professional detachment to authoritative warning. "Mom, I am telling you to step back right now," the officer commanded, his voice deadly serious. "If you interfere with this arrest, I will have you in handcuffs for obstruction of justice. Take 2 steps back." Cynthia froze, her hands hovering in the air. The harsh reality of the threat finally penetrated her delusion. She looked wildly at Thomas, silently begging him to use his money and influence to stop the nightmare. Thomas remained rooted to the grass at the bottom of the altar steps. He was pale, sweating profusely, staring at the flashing police lights. He realized that this was not a country club misunderstanding he could buy his way out of. This was a federal crime, and they had just become collateral damage. From the quiet sanctuary of my Balinese pavilion, I watched the entire exchange on the high-definition feed. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I felt no residual sadness for the family I was losing. Watching Cynthia literally risk her own freedom to shield a criminal while simultaneously screaming lies about me to a crowd of strangers was the absolute final piece of the puzzle. They were prioritizing the golden child to the very bitter end. Even as the handcuffs clicked shut, even as the evidence lay scattered on the altar, my mother still viewed me as the villain, and Brad as the victim. It was the ultimate, irrefutable confirmation of everything I had known for 30 years. The illusion was permanently broken. The toxic cycle that had defined my entire life was completely severed. I had finally given them the exact reality they deserved. Absolute, undeniable closure washed over me, warm and settling. The officers hauled Brad to his feet. He was completely unresponsive, a sobbing, limp weight suspended between 2 detectives. They turned him around, forcing him to face the crowd of 400 guests. The walk back down the aisle was the longest, most brutal march of his life. Flashbulbs went off, people pointed, the whispers were deafening. Brad kept his head down, tears dripping from his chin onto his ruined tuxedo, completely stripped of his stolen identity and unearned arrogance. The police shoved him into the back of a cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut. The engines revved, the tires kicked up gravel, and the convoy of flashing lights tore back down the driveway, leaving my parents standing alone on the manicured lawn. They were completely surrounded by a hostile crowd of elites who now knew exactly what kind of frauds they truly were. On the bamboo table in front of me, my encrypted satellite phone began to vibrate violently. The screen lit up, flashing incessantly. I picked up the device. The notification panel was a cascade of panic. 12 missed calls from Thomas. 19 missed calls from Cynthia. A flood of frantic text messages demanding I answer the phone, begging me to call the police off, ordering me to transfer money for a defense attorney, threatening me with legal action if I did not fix the mess I had created. They were drowning, completely panicked, expecting the daughter they had abused and discarded to throw them a life preserver. I read the latest message from my mother. It was a frantic demand to wire $200,000 for Brad's bail. I smiled. I did not type a response. I did not read the rest of the messages. I simply held down the power button on the side of the phone. The screen prompted me to confirm the shutdown. I swiped my finger across the glass, and the device went completely black. A gentle breeze rolled in off the Indian Ocean, carrying the scent of jasmine and salt. A soft footstep approached from behind. The pavilion attendant stepped into my line of sight, bowing his head respectfully. "Excuse me, Ms. Monterey," the attendant said smoothly. "Would you care for anything else this afternoon?" I looked out over the endless expanse of turquoise water, listening to the absolute magnificent silence of my new life. "Yes," I said, leaning back into the mahogany chair. "I would love another margarita." The transition from the warm, salty air of Bali to the crisp, sterile hum of my Chicago high-rise was jarring, yet profoundly satisfying. 2 weeks had passed since the absolute destruction of Brad's fraudulent empire. I sat behind my massive obsidian desk, staring out the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. This was my domain. Every brick, every server, every contract in this building was a physical testament to the empire I had built entirely on my own. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for my firm when a sharp, frantic commotion erupted just outside my office doors. Before my assistant could even buzz my intercom, the heavy glass double doors were shoved violently open. Thomas and Cynthia burst into the room. My assistant Sarah was right on their heels, her face flushed with panic and frustration. "I am so sorry, Ms. Monterey," Sarah stammered, holding her hands up defensively. They just pushed right past reception and refused to wait. I raised a single hand, signaling Sarah to stop. "It is fine, Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Call security and have them stand by in the hallway." Sarah nodded and retreated, pulling the heavy glass doors shut behind her. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a long, analytical look at the two people standing before me. The transformation was absolutely staggering. Just 14 days ago, they had been the pristine, arrogant picture of high society elitism, looking down their noses at everyone from the front row of a billionaire wedding. Now they looked completely destroyed. Thomas was wearing a suit that looked like it had been slept in for days, his tie loose, and his collar stained with nervous sweat. The deep bruised bags under his eyes spoke of entirely sleepless nights spent fielding relentless calls from federal defense attorneys. Cynthia was even worse. Her signature blowout was a flat, stringy mess. Her designer blouse was deeply wrinkled, and she was clutching her expensive handbag with white-knuckled desperation. The illusion of their superiority had been burned to the ground, and the ashes were smeared all over their faces. "Camille." Cynthia gasped, practically throwing herself toward my desk. She placed her trembling hands on the polished black surface, leaning in with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "You have to stop this. You have to call the police right now and fix this." I did not move a single muscle. Fix what exactly? "Brad is in a federal holding facility," Thomas yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He stepped up beside my mother, his face red and slick with perspiration. "They are denying him bail, Camille. They have frozen all his accounts. They seized his car. He has absolutely nothing. You have to call the district attorney and tell them it was all a terrible mistake." "A mistake," I repeated, my tone dropping to a dangerous icy register. "He stole my corporate identity. He forged my signature on $200,000 worth of credit lines. He trespassed on my private estate and threw a massive party pretending he owned it. Which part of that was a mistake, Thomas?" Cynthia pounded her fist against my desk, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "You can afford it!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls of my office. "You have plenty of money. Just pay it off. Tell them it was a misunderstanding and write a check. He is facing years in federal prison. Camille, years. He is your brother. He is your flesh and blood. I stared at the woman who had birthed me in total silence. I watched her prioritize her golden child to the very bitter end. Even now, with irrefutable proof of his massive federal crimes staring her directly in the face, she felt not a single shred of guilt for what he had done to me. She only cared about saving him from the consequences. For my entire life, I had been the scapegoat. I was the disappointment, the daughter who was never quite good enough to stand in the same room as her precious son. Every rejection, every sneer, every time they looked past my actual achievements to praise his absolute mediocrity, all of it culminated right here. In that exact moment, looking at their haggard, desperate faces, begging me to save the man who tried to ruin me, I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt absolute, undeniable closure. I stood up. I did not rush. I rose from my leather chair slowly, letting my full physical presence dominate the space. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, projecting absolute, unshakable authority. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. You told me I wasn't worthy to stand beside him, I said, my voice echoing with quiet, lethal precision. You were right. I stand far above him. The charges stay. Cynthia let out a choked, horrifying sob. She reached out desperately, trying to grab my arm across the desk, but I stepped back smoothly, remaining completely out of her reach. And if you ever show up at my company again, I continued, my gaze locking onto Thomas, freezing him in his tracks. I will have you arrested for trespassing. I pressed the silver button hidden under the lip of my desk. Instantly, the glass doors swung open. 3 massive security guards stepped into the office, their expressions entirely blank and professional. Escort them out, I ordered, not taking my eyes off my parents. Do not let them back into the building. The guards moved with swift, uncompromising efficiency. They grabbed Thomas by the arms, dragging him backward as he sputtered and cursed in shock. Another guard took Cynthia by the elbow. She fought back violently, her heels slipping on the polished hardwood floor. You are a monster! Cynthia shrieked, tears streaming down her ruined makeup as the guards physically pulled her out of the office. He is your brother. You are going to burn in hell for this. I stood perfectly still, watching through the glass walls as the security team dragged them through the main reception area. The entire floor of my firm had stopped working, captivated by the chaotic spectacle unfolding in the lobby. Thomas was weeping openly now, his shoulders shaking violently, as he finally realized his golden boy was completely beyond saving. Cynthia continued to hurl vicious, desperate insults, her voice echoing down the sleek corporate hallway as they were forcibly moved toward the exit. They reached the main elevator bank. The lead security guard pressed the call button, keeping a firm grip on my struggling mother. The digital numbers above the metal doors ticked downward. A soft ding echoed through the quiet reception area. The polished steel doors parted smoothly. Jasmine Washington stepped out of the elevator car. She looked utterly immaculate in a sharp, tailored black business suit, her posture radiating the exact same lethal authority I had just deployed. She stopped, her dark eyes sweeping over the pathetic crying forms of Thomas and Cynthia, being physically restrained by my security team. She did not look surprised. She looked directly past them, completely ignoring their existence, and locked her gaze with mine through the glass walls of my office. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid shut mercifully, cutting off the shrill, frantic echoing of my mother's voice. Thomas and Cynthia were gone, physically removed from my building and permanently excised from my life. The heavy silence that settled over the reception area was profound. Jasmine Washington did not spare a single backward glance at the 2 hysterical people being dragged into the freight elevator by my security team. She smoothed the pristine lapel of her tailored black blazer, adjusted her leather briefcase, and walked directly toward my office. My assistant Sarah was still standing near the reception desk, her eyes wide with lingering shock from the invasion of my parents. She practically tripped over her own feet trying to intercept Jasmine. Ms. Washington. Sarah stammered, frantically checking her digital tablet. I do not have you on the schedule for today. Let me just announce you. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Let her in, Sarah. Sarah stepped aside instantly. Jasmine pushed open the heavy glass double doors and stepped into my office. The doors clicked shut behind her, sealing us inside the soundproof glass box, high above the Chicago skyline. There was absolutely no awkwardness between us. There was no lingering tension from the explosive events in Monterey, no shared trauma bonding over a manipulative man, and certainly no pity. The energy in the room was entirely different. It was the quiet electric recognition of two powerful women who utterly refused to be victims. Jasmine took her time analyzing my office. She noted the sleek obsidian desk, the minimalist modern art on the walls, and the sheer scale of the operation, visible through the glass walls overlooking the trading floor. She nodded once, a gesture of genuine professional approval, before taking a seat in one of the leather chairs opposite my desk. "You run a very tight ship," Camille Jasmine said. Her voice was smooth, confident, and completely devoid of the aristocratic haughtiness my mother had always desperately tried to emulate. "I learned early on that security is everything," I replied, leaning back in my chair, "especially when you are surrounded by people looking for an open window." Jasmine offered a sharp, knowing smile. She crossed her legs, resting her expensive leather briefcase on her lap. "I came here personally for two reasons." Jasmine began, her dark eyes locking directly onto mine. "First, I wanted to thank you. You executed that delivery with absolute perfection. If that courier had arrived even 5 minutes later, I would have legally tied my family name to a parasite. You saved me from a catastrophic liability. For that, you have my genuine gratitude." "You do not owe me any thanks," I said smoothly. "Brad orchestrated his own destruction. I simply provided the documentation to the right audience. It was a matter of basic accounting." Jasmine let out a sudden, genuine laugh. The sound was bright and sharp in the quiet office. "That is the absolute best part of this entire ridiculous saga," Jasmine said, shaking her head. "The sheer irony of it all. Brad genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any room. He thought he was playing this brilliant multi-level game. He drained your account, stole your identity, and hijacked your estate, all to manufacture an illusion big enough to secure the Washington family empire." I smiled, seeing exactly where she was going. He was convinced I was just a naive, poor IT worker who would quietly absorb the financial hit. "Exactly," Jasmine continued, her eyes gleaming with sharp amusement. "He tried to use you as a stepping stone to reach us, but his massive deceit achieved the exact opposite. He did not secure the Washingtons for himself. He inadvertently secured a genuine empire for you. He put you directly on my father's radar." Jasmine unclasped her briefcase. She reached inside and pulled out a massive, thick legal binder. The cover was stamped with the gold crest of Washington Global Logistics, one of the largest and most profitable shipping conglomerates on the planet. She placed the heavy binder on my desk. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. "Which brings me to my second reason for being here," Jasmine stated, her tone shifting seamlessly from casual irony to absolute business. "My father is an exceptionally hard man to impress. He deals with politicians, billionaires, and industry titans every single day. But watching how you dismantled Bradley Monterey completely fascinated him. I kept my expression neutral, but a surge of professional pride sparked in my chest. "Desmond noted the sheer precision of your operation," Jasmine explained, tapping her manicured fingernail against the cover of the binder. "He saw the high-level digital surveillance, the flawless tracking of offshore accounts, and the absolute ironclad security grid you built to protect your own firm's assets from Brad's interference. He recognized that you are operating on a completely different level of digital infrastructure." "I understand," I said, resting my hands on the desk. "Washington Global Logistics is currently upgrading its entire global security grid," Jasmine continued, leaning forward. "We are overhauling our digital supply chain, our internal server protections, and our international data centers. It is a massive undertaking. We have been fielding pitches from the top tech firms in Silicon Valley for 6 months. My father rejected all of them. He told me this morning that we only want to work with the best. He wants the architect who built the trap that caught Brad." Jasmine pushed the thick legal binder across the smooth black surface of the desk until it rested directly in front of me. "This is a multi-million-dollar 5-year exclusive contract Jasmine said, her gaze steady and serious. You will be the lead contractor overhauling the Washington Empire. We want your firm, Camille. I looked down at the binder. This was not a pity offer. This was not an olive branch. This was a hardcore, highly lucrative business transaction between two titans who recognized value. Brad had spent years telling me I was nothing, constantly reinforcing the lie that I was unworthy of standing in the same room as the elite. My parents had echoed that sentiment every single day of my life, demanding I shrink myself to make room for his inflated ego. They had all been completely spectacularly wrong. I did not need to stand beside Brad. I had utterly eclipsed him. He was currently sitting in a federal holding cell stripped of everything, while I was sitting in my own high-rise office absorbing the very empire he had destroyed his life trying to steal. I reached across the desk. Jasmine extended her hand. We gripped each other's hands in a firm, powerful handshake. There was no hesitation, only the solid agreement of a massive future. I let go of her hand and picked up my solid gold fountain pen. I flipped open the heavy cover of the legal binder, turning directly to the signature page at the very back. The paper was thick and crisp. Without a single second of hesitation, I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly, officially binding my firm to Washington Global Logistics. As I closed the heavy binder, I felt the final definitive click of a lock turning. I was officially closing the door on my toxic past and stepping boldly into a massive, untouchable future. The heavy leather binder clicked shut beneath my hands. The sound was a definitive, resounding period at the end of a very long and very painful sentence. Jasmine Washington gave a firm, approving nod, her dark eyes reflecting the gleaming city lights beyond the glass of my office. The multi-million-dollar contract was signed, sealing not just an incredibly lucrative business deal, but an impenetrable alliance between two women who refused to play the victim. As Jasmine turned and walked out of my office, leaving the chaotic memory of my parents far behind her, I did not look back. I only looked forward. The next 8 months moved with the relentless, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. While my firm rapidly doubled its global footprint, executing the massive security overhaul for the entire Washington Empire, the federal justice system systematically dismantled the fraudulent illusion of Bradley Monterey. There were no high society bailouts to save him this time. The district attorney, eager to make a spectacular public example out of a high-profile white-collar criminal, showed absolutely no mercy. I watched the sentencing on a muted flat screen in my corporate boardroom. Brad, completely stripped of his bespoke Italian suits and his unearned arrogance, stood before the federal judge in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He looked entirely hollowed out. His posture was broken, his shoulders slumped, and his face pale as the judge handed down a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The subsequent bankruptcy hearings were swift and brutal. Every stolen asset, every fraudulent bank account, every luxury car, and every piece of his manufactured life was seized, liquidated, and permanently erased from the ledger. Thomas and Cynthia faced a different, yet equally devastating kind of prison. The social circles they had worshipped their entire lives, the country club elites they had bent over backward to impress, slammed their doors completely shut. High society is notoriously unforgiving of public humiliation, and federal wire fraud is the ultimate unforgivable faux pas. The polite whisper network turned into a deafening roar of total exclusion. Their phone calls went straight to voicemail, their invitations dried up. Their legacy was reduced to a cautionary tale of parental delusion and financial ruin. To fund Brad's futile defense and pay the astronomical federal restitution fines, Thomas was forced into a disgraced early retirement. They had to liquidate their sprawling, pristine suburban estate. I heard through the industry grapevine that they sold off the antique furniture, the jewelry, and the luxury vehicles for pennies on the dollar just to keep the federal defense attorneys on retainer. The parents who had relentlessly demanded absolute perfection from me were forced to downsize into a cramped linoleum-floored two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. They spent their days entirely isolated, pouring their dwindling retirement funds into prison commissary accounts and desperate legal appeals that would never be heard. They had bet their entire existence on the golden child, and he had bankrupted them in every conceivable way. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Chicago office sipping a cup of black coffee as the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the downtown skyline. The glass was cool against my fingertips. I looked down at the bustling city below, feeling a profound, absolute sense of weightlessness. For 3 decades, I had carried the suffocating burden of their impossible expectations. I had internalized their disdain, constantly adjusting my own worth to accommodate their toxic hierarchy. I had allowed them to convince me that I was the problem, that my ambition was cold, and that my independence was a character flaw. But standing here now, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my own hard work, I felt nothing but pristine clarity. The toxic roots that had anchored me to that family were not just severed, they were completely eradicated, pulled from the soil, and left to wither. Society does a terrible, damaging disservice to victims of familial abuse. We are conditioned from birth to believe that loyalty is mandatory simply because of shared genetics. People weaponize the word family to force you to accept behavior you would never tolerate from a stranger, a friend, or a colleague. They demand unconditional forgiveness for unconditional cruelty. They tell you to keep the peace, to be the bigger person, to absorb the damage silently, so the comfortable illusion of the family unit can remain intact. But I realized that walking away was not a failure of loyalty. It was an act of profound self-preservation. Giving my parents the exact harsh reality they had created was not an act of vengeance. It was the ultimate enforcement of a boundary. Walking away was not just survival. It was my absolute greatest triumph. I had finally stopped trying to earn a seat at a table that was specifically built to make me feel small. Instead, I built an empire of my own, and I alone decided who was allowed to pull up a chair. I turned away from the window, walking back toward my massive obsidian desk, as the city lights began to flicker on against the twilight. People always say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes the only water you need is the ocean in Bali to wash away the toxicity they leave behind. Have you ever been pushed out by your own family, only to realize it was the greatest gift they could have ever given you? Share your story in the comments. Crafting narratives of moral resolution often reveals a profound truth. True empowerment comes not from seeking approval from toxic relatives, but from establishing impenetrable boundaries. Camille's journey illustrates that walking away from familiar abuse is an act of ultimate self-preservation. By refusing to rescue her fraudulent brother or enable her manipulative parents, she secured her own untouchable empire. Blood never obligates you to endure financial or emotional betrayal. We must learn to sever toxic roots so our own futures can thrive. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic dynamic to find your true strength? Share your experience in the comments below.